All right. Thank you to everyone who's joining us. We have an announcement as everyone gets settled in and a few more people join. First, we're recording this session and it'll be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during the session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. You'll also find the chat window there where you can engage with other attendees. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and mics on. I think we are ready to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and hand it over to our moderators, Jeff and David.
Hello, good morning, everybody, at least here on the West Coast, almost afternoon for East Coast folks and anybody else beyond that. This is a special session on frontiers of post-fire tree regeneration. And so this session will be mostly today, but will continue into tomorrow morning. David Greene and myself, Jeff Kane, are the moderators of this special session, and we are from Humboldt State University. Our speakers are mostly from the US, but spanning across the country. And then we also have a couple of international speakers. So I'm really excited to hear about each of their talks. And so our first one is from Kim Davis. Kim, if you want to cue up your slides. Kim is from the University of Montana, and she is going to talk about climate drivers of post-fire conifer regeneration across the Western US. Take it away, Kim.
Thanks, Jeff. So yeah, I think it's going to be a great session, and I'm excited to start us off with a talk that's kind of a broad scale look at the climate drivers across conifer forests of the Western US. And so this project is a great big collaboration with many people who are speaking this session or who are in this room. So I just want to first recognize that there's over 50 collaborators. They're all listed on the last slide. I couldn't fit them all on this first slide, but they've contributed not only data, but also through meetings and discussions about analysis in the project in general. So thank you to all of them, and also funding from the Nature Conservancy and the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, funded through the USGS. So, okay, so as more area is burning across the Western US, we've also started to see kind of an explosion of studies looking at the drivers of post-fire regeneration over the past 15 years or so in conifer forests of the Western US. And these studies range in scale from pretty local 1 or 2 fires to broader regional level studies with hundreds of plots. Some of the main, there's been a lot of agreement that for many of the dominant conifer species, distance to seed source or seed availability is a dominant driver of post-fire regeneration. And there's also been studies that are increasingly finding that in recent years, we're starting to see potentially the effects of climate limitation on post-fire regeneration. But this effect can be a little bit more spatially variable. In some areas, we're still seeing pretty abundant post-fire regeneration. It could depend on species, it could depend on geography. And so what we wanted to do was gather all of this regional or local data into one great big study so we could help to identify, where are we seeing climate limitation on post-fire regeneration? Where is this more of an issue? And also which species might be more affected? So our first main research question was, how has climate suitability for post-fire conifer regeneration changed over the past 40 years? And how do we expect it to continue to change in the future for 8 dominant conifer species of the Western US? Our second main question was that we were really interested, as we're also starting to see more area burning at high severity, how does the effect of climate change compare to the effect of fire severity on post-fire regeneration? And then finally, if we're seeing more area at high severity and we're also seeing more stressful post-fire climate conditions, is there an interaction between those two, or is it just an additive effect on the post-fire regeneration? So to do this, as I said, we gathered this huge network of collaborators who all contributed data from areas that they had studied in fires that burned between the early 1980s and 2018. So our range of time since fire varies from 2 years to 32 years. We have over 10,000 plots, and we focused on the species that I've listed here to the right. And those species represent 72% of the basal area of the conifer forest that I've highlighted in this map. And so they're really an important component of these forests, and understanding what's happening with these species will really help us understand what's happening with these forests in the future. I should mention that a couple of these species like ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine are really difficult to distinguish as seedlings, so we modeled them together. And likewise, white fir and grand fir hybridize in much of the range in Oregon and central Idaho. So we also modeled those two species together. So our modeling approach was to use binomial generalized linear mixed models with fire event as a random effect. And the response variable was just whether there was any regeneration or not in the plots. We made one model with all of the species combined to get kind of just a broad understanding of what's happening in these forests that are really dominated by these species, as well as making individual species models to understand what's happening and how it varies between different species. We did model selection with tenfold cross-validation based on maximizing the AUC. Predictors that we included in our models were a few different types. So the first was climate. We used 4-kilometer resolution data from GridMet. Each model had one 30-year climate predictor, like 30-year climatologies of either climatic water deficit or actual evapotranspiration. And then each model also had a variety of different post-fire weather or climate anomalies that cover the years 1 through 5 following the fire. And those were the variables that we kind of selected using our model selection. We also represented distance to seed source or seed availability through distance to seed source, as well as what we call mean tree cover, but it was the mean tree cover in a 300-meter radius around our plot based on satellite imagery taken 5 years after the fire. So kind of a metric of abundance of seed sources on the landscape. And then we also included satellite drive fire severity as the relativized burn ratio. Some of our sites had recent disturbance within 50 years before they burned. And so like beetle outbreaks, for example, or fuel treatments. And so we also included this in the model, as well as time since fire, heat load index, which was at 90-meter resolution to kind of capture the topographic variability we didn't get with our climate predictors. And then where it was important, depending on species, we included variety or subspecies. So I'll just present mostly the results from the all species model for the sake of time, but they're pretty similar to what we saw for individual species models. So for example, as has been found repeatedly in the literature, we found that distance to seed source is really an important driver of post-fire tree regeneration. This was consistent across all our species, with slightly longer dispersal for lodgepole pine, which we couldn't differentiate between serotinous or not in our data set. And then we also saw this effect of that mean tree cover, which was kind of the abundance of seed sources on the landscape. We also saw strong effects of post-fire climate. And so, sorry, I should have said, these are the response curves for each of our predictors where we're holding all the other predictors constant. And so what you can see is that for the all species model, we had 2 different post-fire climate variables that both represented dry years following the fire. And so when you had an abnormally dry year following the fire, you were less likely to see recruitment. But there were interactions such that this was mostly true at dry sites. So in this situation where you had high growing season deficit, water deficit, so a really dry year following the fire, it was less important in some of our wetter sites than it was in our drier sites. And what we found that was pretty interesting was that it also depended on fire severity. So this post-fire climate variable is the maximum consecutive rain-free days. So was there a period of prolonged rain-free days that might cause seedling mortality? And if there was, and you burned at high severity, you were less likely to see recruitment. However, in low severity sites, we didn't see this relationship. We also saw an effect of overall average climate or 30-year mean climatologies, in which we saw less recruitment at drier sites, as you would expect. And this effect was more pronounced when we had dry post-fire conditions. And then finally, we also did see some effects of the other disturbances. And so if you had a beetle outbreak before the fire, you were less likely to have post-fire recruitment. And if you had a fuel treatment before the fire, you were actually more likely to see post-fire recruitment. So what we then did was we took our models and we wanted to project them across the West. And to do this, we used a few different scenarios in terms of different time periods of climate, as well as a low and a high fire severity scenario. So the fire severity scenarios that we used in the projections incorporated distance to seed source, satellite dry fire severity, and that kind of landscape level tree cover metric. And when we did this and we made projections across the West for our all species model, we see some pretty significant trends over time. So here we have the low severity projections in the top row and the high severity in the bottom row. And as you move from left to right, you move from cooler, wetter, past climate conditions into the future projections. And you can see that as we move through time, we start to get more of that red and orange on the landscape, projecting that we're going to have less climatically suitable conditions for regeneration of these 8 species that we modeled. And so what you'll also notice is that that kind of moves northward over time, but in much of the Northwest and Northern Rockies will retain high climate suitability, at least in the low severity scenarios. And so the other major pattern here is that you'll notice a big difference between the top row and the bottom row. So for example, if you look at the 2000s, if you move from a low severity scenario to a high severity scenario, that's more of a change than you get if you move from the 2001 to 2020 into the future climate scenarios. So this has potentially has pretty big management implications, and we are interested in how this effect might vary over space. So what we did is we took these continuous recruitment probabilities, and we turned them into, yes, we're likely to have recruitment, or no, we're not likely to have recruitment based on a statistically derived threshold. And we then compared the 2 different scenarios to figure out, were there areas where we were likely to have recruitment if we had low severity fire, but we weren't likely to have recruitment if we had high severity fire. So that's what I'm showing here. And these yellow areas are areas where there's no difference between the 2 scenarios. So for example, in these northwest areas that are cooler and wetter, we were likely to have recruitment under both fire severity scenarios. And in these drier areas in the southwest, we were unlikely to have recruitment in both scenarios. But all of these blue areas are areas that we can highlight where if we had a high severity fire, we were unlikely to have recruitment. But if we had a low severity fire, we were likely to have recruitment. So that's helping to highlight areas where some sort of management action that can help reduce fire severity might have the most impact in terms of post-fire regeneration. Our individual species models all showed significant effects of both post-fire weather or climate and also the 30-year mean climatologies. But we did see differences between species in terms of what we expect under the future projections. And so what I'm showing here is the distribution of recruitment probabilities across the landscape. Each row represents a different region. So the Northwest, the Northern Rockies, California and the Klamath, and then the Southern Rockies. And what you can see is that Engelmann spruce, and this was similar to subalpine fir, there isn't a huge change over time. There's a little bit of change in some ecoregions, but really we're not even projecting too much change in recruitment probabilities in the Northern Rockies at all under the future climate scenarios. Some of our lower elevation species like ponderosa pine and white fir, we've already seen a significant shift from the 80s into the 2000s in climate suitability for recruitment, but we expect to continue to see some changes in the future. And then what kind of surprised me was that lodgepole pine was actually the species that we saw the most change between the current climate and the future climate. So really high recruitment probabilities in the 80s and 90s over on the right, and then that shifts to really low recruitment probabilities under the future climate scenario. I should say this is the projections under the high fire severity scenario, and fire severity was important. Fire severity, including seed availability and fire severity, was important for all of these species, except for lodgepole pine, where there's really less of an effect because it's serotinous. But when we started to dig into the fire severity effect, what we also saw in the individual species models, similar to the all species model, was that fire severity can moderate the effect of post-fire climate. And so this is just an example for Douglas fir, where it depended on the post-fire climate in terms of the water deficit during the growing season in the years after the fire. But if it was in a low severity site, there really wasn't much effect of this. In the high severity sites, we saw a big decline in recruitment probability when you had a hot, dry year following the fire. And so this kind of highlights that fire severity, beyond just affecting seed availability, can also affect recruitment through other mechanisms, and we suspect through microclimate conditions. So this is some work that just came out of our lab by Kira Wolf, who's a grad student. And she showed that the microclimate conditions in high and moderate severely burned sites are much more stressful for seedlings than in unburned areas.
Just letting you know, 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks. And so when you start to look at this across the landscape and how that affects what that looks like over time, and so we really can see that effect over time. And so here, this is again Douglas fir in just 2 regions, and instead of dividing the distribution by time, I've divided it now by fire severity. And so you can see the red areas are the distribution of recruitment probabilities in the high severity scenario, and the blue are the low severity. And so in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of overlap between those 2 distributions. But as you move through time, there's less overlap as we see a big decline in recruitment probability in the high severity scenario, but less of an effect in the low severity scenario, where we are having some sort of buffering effect of those more stressful post-fire climate conditions. So overall, we did find that forests across the Western US have become less resilient to wildfire due to changes in climate, and we expect that trend to continue, but it did vary spatially, and it really depends on, and also depended on species. So we saw very different impacts between different species. So for example, a big effect of climate change on lodgepole pine compared to Engelmann spruce or subalpine fir. We also found that the relative effect of seed availability and fire severity was similar to, or in many cases, even greater than the effect of changing climate or our future climate scenarios up to mid-century. And so this has pretty important management implications. And then finally, we found that high severity fire can amplify the effects of the warm, dry post-fire weather, potentially through these effects on microclimate. And so just quickly, our management implications, we think is that in some of these southern ecoregions, we should just start expecting limited post-fire regeneration and planning for that, before the fire even happens. And so yesterday there was a really great session on post-fire management that had a lot of great ideas of how we can start thinking about management in these areas where regeneration may be more limited. That said, our climate data was at 4-kilometer resolution. So it's really kind of macro scale climate conditions. And within any one of those cells, there'll likely be local site factors or microrefugia that are really important for promoting post-fire regeneration or forest persistence. And maybe we should focus on identifying those areas and trying to protect them. And then secondly, I know we all recognize the importance of reducing fire severity and where it's ecologically appropriate in these dry mixed conifer forests, but I think that this study really just shows that, one, the mechanisms that reducing fire severity will help are both seed availability and microclimate, and that also these effects could be large enough to help partially offset declines in regeneration that we expect due to changes in climate in the next 30 years or so. And then just thanks to my funding, and also, again, huge thanks to all the many collaborators who have contributed to this project. That's all I have.
Great, thank you, Kim.
Yeah.
I think we have time for a question or two. If you want to just verbalize it, just unmute yourself, or you can type it into the Q&A.
I have a really small question. You had on the slide, individual species vary in response to climate, something like that. You had dotted lines indicating unlikely versus likely regeneration, but the placement of those lines varied by species. What determined that? Yeah,
so that is just a function of when you have the binomial models, if there's different prevalence of the presence versus absence in the response. When you make the model, the threshold probability that maximizes accuracy will depend on that prevalence. So for example, like in the ponderosa pine model, we had more zeros than ones. And so that had a lower threshold. So I determined that threshold by looking at the point on the receiver operator curve that maximized the specificity and sensitivity. So it's kind of like a statistical artifact.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I think we'll transition to our next speaker, Lucas, if you want to share your screen. Thank you, Kim.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucas Harris. I'm a postdoc in Alan Taylor's lab at Penn State. And it's hard to follow up on such a great, really broad scale talk, but I'll be zooming way in and talking about post-fire tree regeneration in a small national park, Lassen Volcanic National Park in California. And this is a place that Alan Taylor has been working in for decades now. And I've had the good fortune to spend a few field seasons there. I'll be focusing this talk on thinking about tree regeneration in the context of multiple successive fires. And I'll talk some about legacy effects. And then Dani is actually going to talk next about a particular data set that we just collected field data for this summer. So settle in and get ready to hear a good deal about Lassen National Park. So we all study tree regeneration, of course, because we're interested in getting an advanced indicator of how forests are going to recover following wildfires. But we also know that it's only a matter of time before the next fire rolls through. And there's this question of, what is the next fire going to do? And so there's been a real surge in interest lately, it seems, in studying tree regeneration in this context of successive fires. And there's been some good work looking at tree regeneration following, 2 or more fires. And there's been especially interest in looking at short interval fires and their potential effects on vegetation. But I think there's also a lot of unanswered questions. And when you start thinking in this kind of framework of multiple fires, all sorts of complications and interesting questions come up. One question is, what are the legacy effects of past fires on tree regeneration after a reburn? And kind of a related question, how do fires interact with each other via changes to vegetation and fuels? And then finally, a question that's easy to ask but harder to answer is, how much post-fire regeneration is going to survive a reburn if and when it does occur? So with these kind of big overarching questions in mind, I'm going to start off by summarizing some recently published work that we did on tree regeneration and fire severity in Lassen Park in Northern California. And then I'm going to move into some, by necessity, preliminary work on the potential impact of this year's Dixie Fire on forests in the park. So Lassen Volcanic National Park, it's in Northern California in the Southern Cascade Range. And a lot of the park is kind of rolling terrain, pretty heavily forested. And it's relatively mesic mixed conifer forests, oftentimes dominated by Jeffrey pine, red and white fir, and you find quite a bit of lodgepole pine in more marginal sites. And I want to point out that these middle elevation forests are relatively less studied. There's been, quite a bit of work in dry pine and mixed conifer forests on post-fire tree regeneration. There's also been quite a bit of work in high elevation forests that typically experience stand replacing fires, but these kind of middle elevations can get somewhat complicated and are worth studying. I also want to point out that much of the park was never logged, which is nice, and that there have been multiple prescribed fires and wildfires in the park since the 80s, and I'm showing fire severity of these fires here in terms of percentage of tree basal area loss, and I'll be showing fire severity maps like this again a couple times. And Alan's lab has collected a whole trove of field data over the years, and I'm going to be talking about a few different field data sets, all of which I was involved in data collection on. One data set is this lodgepole pine flat field data from the north central part of the park. And this is longitudinal data. These are plots that were measured in 2008 and again in 2019. And similarly, we have data from plots that were originally set up to quantify surface fuels in the late 90s and that we remeasured in 2019. And then finally, we were out there in the park this summer collecting data on tree regeneration in a number of fire scars in the park. And those data form Dani's master's thesis work, and that's what she's going to be talking about mainly in her presentation. So I want to start off by summarizing some recently published work that we conducted in these lodgepole pine flats in the north central part of the park. These are, low-lying flat basins, very frost-prone and therefore somewhat marginal sites that are dominated by Sierra lodgepole pine. And the great thing about these plots is that they were remeasured. They burned in a wildfire in 1984. The plots were surveyed in 2008. It reburned in a 2012 wildfire, and we came back out in 2019 and remeasured the plots. And honestly, we weren't expecting to find that much. Sierra lodgepole pine is not known to be serotinous. So we expected that patterns of tree regeneration in 2019 would follow sort of the configuration of live trees to provide seed source. But unexpectedly, we found that instead, tree regeneration in 2019 very closely tracked the severity of this first 1984 wildfire. So a really interesting and unexpected result. And we came up with a couple, theories to potentially explain why we saw these really strong legacy effects of this first fire on tree regeneration after another fire. And one set of explanations focused on kind of localized effects of this 1984 wildfire on ground cover and fuels and understory vegetation that either persisted through the second fire or might have been amplified by the second fire. For example, tree regeneration was absent from all the subplots, 10-meter square subplots that had high log cover in 2008. And the potential story there is that these are areas that burned at high severity in 1984, therefore had high log cover in 2008. All those logs burned up in the 2012 fire and may have heated up soils, certainly would have removed litter and duff and impacted understory vegetation, and therefore created kind of localized inhospitable sites for tree regeneration following the 2012 fire. We were also out there in the field in 2013, and we noted a bunch of seemingly unburned and intact cones on lodgepole pines that have been killed by the 2012 fire. And so there's also potential for a post-fire canopy seed bank to have influenced tree regeneration at this site, which we go into in the paper that we recently published. And really, this work points to the need for more research on legacy effects and their potential impacts on forest recovery and post-fire tree regeneration. And this is a bit of an aside, but it's certainly related to this question of forest recovery and reburns. We also recently published an analysis of fire severity in that 2012 fire, the Reading fire. And we found that past prescribed fires were able to reduce fire severity of the Reading fire by an estimated 32%. But in areas that had prescribed fires and also had fire suppression operations that were prevalent during the fire, severity was reduced by a pretty substantial 72%. And this really highlights a potential additional benefit of fuel treatments. Not only did prescribed fires reduce wildfire severity by themselves, they also acted as important anchor points for suppression operations, which seems to have reduced fire severity further in this particular fire. So I mentioned we were out in the field this summer measuring tree regeneration plots that Dani is going to be discussing in depth. And as we were out there, the Dixie Fire started, and probably most of you are familiar with the Dixie Fire. It burned almost 1 million acres in California. That's the second largest fire now, I think, in California on record. Here's a photo of the smoke and haze. We left the field a little bit early due to this fire, but we were still able to collect a good deal of data before that. And just a couple weeks ago, I was able to calculate or estimate fire severity from the Dixie Fire in Lassen Park. The northwest arm of the fire burned through the majority of the park. And here I'm showing an estimate of percentage tree basal area loss from the fire. And I calibrated these to field plots that we measured in 2013. And the Dixie Fire ended up burning over about 2/3 of the field plots that I showed a few slides ago. And so it presents, an interesting research opportunity potentially. And you can see there are some big high severity patches, particularly in parts of the park that had not experienced any previous fires. And it does appear visually that perhaps past fires moderated fire severity of the Dixie Fire somewhat. We'll have to do a little more analysis on that. I was able to do a comparison of fire severity in the Dixie Fire with a couple previous fires. In these plots, the darker blues indicate clusters of more values. And what we found in our lab, and many others have found as well, is that reburn severity often tends to follow prior fire severity, as in there's a positive relationship. And that this relationship also tends to strengthen with increasing time since fire. And this seems to be the case in the Dixie Fire in the park. The left panel is a comparison of the 2012 reading fire with the Dixie Fire. See that there's a positive relationship in fire severity, but it's not particularly strong. In particular, there's some areas that burned at high severity in the reading fire that then burned at low severity in the Dixie Fire, potentially fuel limitations at work there. But if you look at one of the older burns, the 1997 Huffer Fire on the right, you see there's a pretty good positive relationship indicating reinforcement of fire severity patterns in the Dixie Fire that were created by the Huffer Fire. And why you might see these self-reinforcing patterns is pretty evident if you look at photos from the field. This is a photo we took this summer, looking down at the Huffer Fire scar, and you can see, in the foreground, there's areas that burned at high severity in Huffer Fire that are just vast shrub fields, and then in the background you see areas that burned at low severity in the Huffer Fire that are, intact forests that had, fuel reductions and were thinned out by the Huffer Fire, and those tended to burn low in the Dixie Fire, it seems. So I was able to do a quick comparison of the severity of the Dixie Fire with tree regeneration in those field plots I showed in that map some slides ago. And what I found in this preliminary analysis, which is interesting, is that plots with abundant tree regeneration seem to have burned at higher severity in the Dixie Fire. And one reason why this could be is that perhaps these sites with abundant tree regeneration, are just generally more productive sites that might have greater fuel productivity and therefore more fuels to support a high severity reburn. And in support of this, we have those 40 plots that we had quantified surface fuels at in 2019. If you take that subset of plots, then areas with abundant tree regeneration had more than twice as much total surface fuel loading compared to the other plots in 2019. So that supports this greater fuel productivity potential explanation. And this work it points to an interesting, potential for reburns to maybe act as a check on forest recovery. If it's true more generally that areas with more tree regeneration also tend to get hit a little bit harder in reburns, And that's something we want to know about and plan for. And so to conclude, one of the great things about our work in Lassen Park is that we have longitudinal data sets, resurveyed plots. And these data sets are just invaluable, and they can be used to uncover sometimes unexpected legacy effects, and just to track forest change and potential recovery in the face of successive fires. So I've gone over this potential for strong legacy effects of past fires on tree regeneration following a reburn. I gave that lodgepole pine example, which is a small data set, but a very interesting one. And then I've also showed that fire severity patterns seem to have been reinforced in the Dixie fire compared with previous fires. There's also this question based on my preliminary Dixie fire analysis of whether areas with more tree regeneration tend to burn more severely in reburns. And that's something that merits some further research, I think. And then finally, I think there's good opportunity to go out and resurvey some of these plots that burned up in the Dixie fire and do some work related to the Dixie fire and see, just how much post-fire tree regeneration survived the Dixie fire and where and under what conditions. So there's some interesting follow-up work to do. So big thank you to everyone involved in this work, and thanks for listening to the talk. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Lucas. That we have about 4 minutes left for questions, so please chime in, or you can type it in the Q&A.
This is Pepe Villegas. I wanted to ask a question about what does it mean when you have a high severity after a high severity fire? I mean, you're saying they're both high severity, but the first one was in a forested system, the second one was in a shrub system.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so I can see how you calculated based on remote sensing, but what does it mean ecologically?
I mean, ecologically, what it means, a number of the shrub fields we surveyed actually had tree regeneration present in them this year and 2 years ago. So a lot of these areas seem to have the capacity to recover to forests eventually. But of course, a high severity reburn will tend to maintain that state as a shrub field and maybe reinforce a state shift to shrub fields from forest.
So can you have a low severity within a shrub field then? Is there such a thing as a I mean, right?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. It would probably be pretty hard to get those fire effects in these big shrub fields. There are areas in kind of the north central part of the park that seem not to have burned in the Dixie fire that were covered by a lot of shrubs, which is interesting that the fire didn't get into there.
So also I'll follow up on that then. So what is, if you're calculating percent basal area loss, how do you calculate that when there is no basal area, right? I mean, to have basal area, you need trees and you have just shrubs. So
it's true. It's true. Yeah. We use that metric because, generally the park is pretty heavily forested, but you're absolutely right. It's, it's hard to use in shrub fields. And we do have CBI field data as well. And we go back and forth between the two, and they tend to be, pretty closely related to one another. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It doesn't make too much sense in shrub fields to think about tree basal area.
no, but in general, I think you got a great study, and you're one of the only people that actually has field data. So I think that you can actually get at some of these questions. You know what I mean? So I mean, it's a great presentation. And say hi to Cal for me.
Sure.
All right. Good questions, Pepe. We're going to transition to the next speaker. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we got a little less than a minute, but Dani, if you can share your screen.
Absolutely. So I, full disclosure, have not yet learned how Zoom works fully. So unfortunately, I am going to show you the ugly side of this briefly.
It's all good.
There we go. Okay. So continuing on this theme of zooming in on Lassen National Park, I'm going to be sharing some early results from my thesis project, which, as Lucas mentioned, we just went out this summer and collected the data for. So fire regimes in the Western United States are shifting quite a bit, and climate change is causing hotter and drier fire seasons, driving increased fuel aridity and increased annual area burned, sorry. And in forests that are adapted to frequent low severity fires, a century of fire suppression has also allowed the accumulation of massive fuel loads. And so in many forests, fire severity and area burned at high severity are increasing, and that poses some interesting challenges for forest recovery. And one of those issues is shrubs. They have a fire scarified seed bank that lingers and germinates after fire, or they can resprout and quickly dominate a site before trees can get in there. And then not only do they compete with trees for site resources, as Lucas mentioned, they facilitate high severity fires coming back into the site after the first burn. And that kind of gets into some of those legacy effects that he was talking about. And fire history at the site may have more to do with regeneration than the most recent fire did. So areas that initially burned at low severity, burning at high severity following that may regenerate fine, but high severity followed by high severity tends not to lead to good regeneration down the road. And then in forests that are prone to high severity fire, propagules can persist at a site through a fire event via adaptations like suckering and serotiny. But in forests adapted to frequent low severity fire, the strategy for most species is to just survive the initial fire event. As fire severity increases though, and we see larger high severity patches, fewer of those mature trees are surviving in the landscape, and the distance between them, and the distance between them increases and really creates problems for regeneration success. And so there are a lot of moving pieces in play with tree regeneration. And what we're really trying to do here is dig further into an understanding of middle elevation forests' responses to all of these shifts that we're seeing as we transition back into active fire regimes in much of the West. And so what we were looking to answer with just this summer's work is what are the dominant drivers of post-fire conifer regeneration in the system? And then under what conditions is post-fire regeneration meeting or exceeding Forest Service stocking densities? So this past summer, we went to Lassen, which is a middle elevation volcanic plateau near the southern edge of the Cascades Range in Northern California. And we studied regeneration in 7 fires that burned between 1996 and 2012. Most of the locations that were sampled had only burned once, but about 10% of our plots were in reburned areas from fires that burned between 1984 and 2006. And those are the fires that are labeled in gray on the map to the left there. So at each plot, we set a main plot and then 2 subplots. And in the main plot, we characterized regeneration, distance to seed source, topographic relative moisture, so site level controls on wetness, basically, and shrub cover. And then in subplots, we resampled regeneration and characterized ground cover. And then in addition to the field measured distance to nearest live tree, I also classified nape imagery using random trees in ArcMap to get some maps of canopy and forest cover in the broader landscape context. And so we also have percent canopy cover in 7 different neighborhoods to determine whether higher densities of seed sources at different scales are having an effect on regeneration density. And then distance to the nearest forest edge. And a forest was defined as, what did I call it? 3 contiguous 30-meter pixels with more than 20% canopy cover. And then for our analyses, we're using random forest with automated variable selection using vsurf. And the model performance is evaluated with out-of-bag error. And of all of the models of regeneration that I tried, density, presence, absence, and then stocking in 2 or 3 classes, the 2-class stocking model performed the best. And so the stocking level was defined in a 1981 publication out of the Southern Oregon Cascades. And that set a good stocking level at 70%, which is about 435 seedlings per hectare. And then partial dependence plots and variable importance to interpret model outputs. So we made it to 186 plots, 142 of which had some amount of regeneration present. There were 4 common species. The firs were more abundant where they occurred, but the pines were more frequently occurring. So fir occurred in about half the plots with an average of about 1,400 stems per hectare, and pines occurred in 60% of the plots with about 550 stems per hectare. And Western white pine was observed in just a handful of plots. We had it in, I think, 25 with really low densities, and aspen was present, negligible though. And half of the plots were regenerating at or above that stocking density threshold that we set. And so that 2-class stocking model ended up with an out-of-bag error rate of about 27% and retained 5 variables that are listed in this figure off to the right here. So 1935 forest type and distance to forest edge were the most important variables, followed by simple terrain metrics, aspect and elevation, and then very distantly Arctostaphylos patula, green leaf manzanita. And the mean decrease in accuracy when the green leaf is removed is negative, but it was retained by the automated variable selection procedure because of the Gini score. We don't use that for interpreting importance because it's very volatile, but when I removed the variable from the model and ran it again, the out-of-bag error did increase by a few percent, so we left that in. The 1935 forest type variable that was our most important, we had 4 major forest types that were represented in the study area, which correspond to the 4 most commonly encountered regenerating species in those plots. So white fir has a very strong positive effect on stocking density, but that may not be entirely representative of the situation in white fir stands. Only 10 of our 186 plots occurred in that forest type, and all 10 of those were fully stocked. So those 10 plots also happened to burn at lower severity than the other plots did, which could also be another driver sort of dictating the differences between those groups. Also very important was distance to forest edge, which is acting as both our seed source and our severity metric in this case. Plots located more than 200 meters from a forest edge tended to burn at much higher severity, which is, expected. Higher severity means much more around you is lost in that fire. And then beyond that 200 meters from a forest edge, you rarely see stocked plots. At the forest edge, there is a neutral effect on regeneration. It sort of dips down towards the y-axis there. Propagules may be readily available, but if you're under more closed canopy, then competition for resources may be prohibiting dense regeneration in some of these areas. It peaks around 50 meters from a forest edge, which is about a tree height. So that's to be expected. And then it declines pretty steadily after that. Topography was two of the variables that the model retained were sort of getting at topography. Those were aspect and elevation. Northeast slopes tended to host more stocked plots than southwest slopes, which is to be expected given microclimates. And the general trend with elevation looks like it wants to be positive, but there's this break sort of right in the middle of the graph there. Elevation in Lassen is really closely linked with forest types, transitioning from pine in those lower lying areas to fir, particularly red fir at very high elevations. And of the 2 pine forest types, lodgepole had the more positive influence on stocking. And like Lucas mentioned, lodgepole pine in Lassen is the non-serotinous variety, but some previous work that he's done in the park has pointed to some potentially pseudo-serotinous behavior, where unburnt cones in the canopy can still contain seed and then drop those to the ground. In this figure on the right here that should look very familiar, you're seeing some seeds on recently burnt ground just a year after the Reading fire moved through the area. And the photo on the bottom here is one that was taken this summer that I think really shows what that might look like a few years down the line after some of those seeds have successfully germinated. The Jeffrey pine forest type, on the other hand, was not positively associated with stock plots. So to understand that relationship, I actually had to break it down by elevation. The partial dependence plot on elevation had that sharp break right around 1,950 meters above sea level. And if you separate plots in the Jeffrey pine forest type above and below that threshold, you really see a complete 180 in stocking rates. So below that, Jeffrey pine forests were regenerating at or above stocking densities about 70% of the time. But above that, they were only stocked 30% of the time. So this may be driven by cold air drainage patterns in the park. Jeffrey pine is very cold tolerant, but shade intolerant. And so although it would survive at the cooler temperatures at higher elevations, the more shade tolerant fir may be excluding it from that zone. Greenleaf manzanita was retained by the automatic variable selection procedure, but the effect size on the partial dependence plot is really minimal. The axis goes from, I think, negative 0.05 to positive 0.1. I have not interpreted anything from it. I think there is an interaction that it has with other variables that could be important. I have to dig a little bit further into this, and obviously I have many more models that I need to throw at it and see what's going on with that. But I think shrub cover varies quite a bit with elevation and with forest type, and so it could be sort of responding to those drivers. And so I don't know how my time is actually, but the primary driver of regeneration stocking versus understocking in Lassen seems to be elevation. And along this gradient, forest types and moisture vary, historic fire regimes are going to vary, shrubs in the understory community differs, and elevation and aspect are pretty closely linked with a lot of environmental variables in the park, basically. And so within the park, areas that we would expect to have stronger regeneration are in those lower frost pockets where the pines seem happy and the shrubs don't really intrude on their personal space at all. And of course, having nearby seed sources is important, as has been demonstrated quite a bit. So thank you to my field crew, which was probably the most overpaid field crew ever. It was postdoc, another grad student, and my professor. And thank you to the park for facilitating all of this work. And thank you to the Dixie Fire for some interesting final days.
Great, Dani, thanks. It looks like we have about 7 minutes for questions.
Oh, we finished early.
Yeah. Any questions for Dani? Please feel free to chime in, and then it looks like we might have some questions. Looks like here's one. Are high severity legacy effects more tied to vegetation change or to soil change? And I don't know if this may have been for Lucas, but.
That may have been for Lucas.
Yeah.
Top of my head, I think sterilizing the soil seed bank is probably a very important effect of high severity fire. But it's tough to say whether that outweighs distances to seed source and moisture availability. It's tough to say. That's not one I've specifically looked at. I'll toss that to Lucas, actually.
Yeah, sorry about that. Maybe if we have
That's
time,
okay.
Lucas could check it.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting question. And, I'd be happy to talk afterward, answer any questions.
Great. Well, we'll come back to that because there is another question that I think is actually for Dani. Did you look at individual species models, or are you considering that analysis? It seems like there are some key differences among species that may get muddled.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm planning on looking at differences in sizes of regeneration. So small seedlings versus larger regeneration in saplings, and then also species specific models. Yeah, like I mentioned, this is an ongoing project for my master's thesis. So this is very early results. The next couple of weeks, I'm going to be digging into that.
Yeah, and I'll say just this will be a shameless plug for my talk because we also went out to the reading fire and looked at lodgepole and saw that unique non-pseudoserotinous aspect, and we think we have the mechanism of how that can occur. So it'd be fun to chat about that. All right. Oh, we have another question here. How confident are you in the identification of seedlings of the two pine species?
It's actually really easy to identify the pines in Lassen. Jeffrey, lodgepole, and western white are, lodgepole and the other two are distinctly different from each other. The needles are a very different width. For Jeffrey versus western white, you do have to be careful and count the number of fascicles per bundle. But those are not a challenge at all. Where we got into debates was between red and white fir a lot. That's a tough call to make in a lot of cases. There's some disagreement over the best indicators.
I had another question. Is there no more? So in the Southwest, it seems like the logs play a really important role, so after the fire, we don't see seedlings for like the first 5 years. And then when those snags start falling, they create that microhabitat. That's when we see seedlings. So in California, that's not the case, I guess. It's more of a ponderosa pine, and some of these firs can reestablish without shade.
So it's tough to say. The log heavy areas that we encountered tended also to have not a small amount of shrub cover. So I can't say that with standing snags, you're not seeing nursery objects. It may just be that those are different. And then there were some areas that so some of the higher elevation areas where there were no fallen logs and there were no shrubs, we did see less regeneration in those areas. So that definitely may be occurring. I also want to do a subplot analysis in the coming weeks and sort of shrink my spatial scale down a little bit more and look at how those things are interacting.
So one follow-up on that. So do you see any kind of time since fire effect? That is, do you see kind of more seedlings as time goes by?
So initially, I don't think so. Where do we go? There we are. So regeneration counts by the different fires. The 1996 Crater Fire is our oldest, and the Reading Fire is our most recent. And there's not a ton of difference in the counts that we were seeing between those fires that happened, 20 plus years ago versus only 9. But I think that's one of the things I want to look at with the different size classes of regeneration and see whether there's a difference that shakes out if I separate those a bit.
All right, thank you.
All right. Well, I think we'll start to transition to our next speaker. Michael, if you're ready, and then I don't know if Lucas wanted to chime in about the question that was directed to him in the meantime.
I have to be reminded of that question. So it's on legacy effects and logs, or what was
No, it was, yeah, high severity legacy effects. Are they more tied to vegetation change or soil change?
Yeah, that's really interesting. We couldn't really get at that in our work because we just had kind of like subplot ground cover data, but it definitely is something that I'd be interested in talking about. And if someone could set up a study to examine that, that'd be really interesting. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks for replying, Lucas. All right, I think we will shift to Mike. Mike, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Toolan. I'm a master's student at Penn State, advised by Ecology. Also got to work with Morgan Barnum, Tim Shearman of Tall Timbers, and Jim Cronin from the Pacific Northwest Research Station on this project. But I'm here today to give you some preliminary results on our study of quaking aspen regeneration following high severity prescribed ferns in the mountains of central Utah.
Mike, it's a little quiet if you can speak up. I don't know.
Sure, yeah. Can you hear me now?
That's great.
All right. So quaking aspen, or Populus tremuloides, is the most widely distributed deciduous tree species in North America, but for the purposes of this study, we focused on those located in the western U.S. They reproduce clonally via root suckers by way of this extensive, highly connected lateral root system, and they form these kind of large and at times expansive clonal groves. But when put in competition with others, they perform poorly. They're very shade intolerant. So as far as the successional perspective goes, they tend to be early colonizers of disturbed sites. And we know that they're highly valued, obviously, for their aesthetics, but also for their high levels of biodiversity, especially compared to those conifer forests with which they co-occur. And they're in decline in a lot of places in the West due to a number of factors, but primarily successional processes, undulate browse, and reduction in fire. So as aspen cover declines, conifer cover increases, and as conifers encroach and persist, there's a pretty dramatic decrease in aspen sucker production. You also get the additional risk of potential increased wildfire hazards when things like bark beetle outbreaks happen and cause large-scale mortality events, leading to a lot of standing dead and heavy woody fuels on the forest floor. So there are a lot of different treatment options they use to kind of reduce the conifer basal area in these aspen groves. And one of those, which we'll be talking about today, is high severity, large scale standard placing prescribed fires. And the purpose of our study is to kind of evaluate the effectiveness of these treatments for the purposes of restoring aspen to these areas, and to get at some of the factors we think might be driving aspen regeneration post-fire. So this project is part of a much larger effort called the Fire and Smoke Model Evaluation Experiment, also known as FASME project. This is a multi-agency interdisciplinary effort to measure fuels, fire behavior, weather, smoke, and fire effects for the purposes of evaluating and improving fire and smoke models for operation and use. The fires that we studied here were part of their Southwest campaign. They conducted a series of large-scale standard placing prescribed fires in the Fish Lake National Forest of Utah. And these fires were, again, executed by the forest for the purpose of aspen regeneration and fuel reduction. I just want to mention how these kind of like large-scale prescribed fire events are pretty rare and really cool to be able to study and to be able to instrument ahead of time and really come up with fun study design to get at some of these things we're not always able to look at. So for locational context, the Fish Lake National Forest is just south and west of the center of the state of Utah, sandwiched between the Manti-La Salle and Dixie National Forests. And our study sites were all located in the Richfield district of the Fish Lake National Forest, with our Annabella Reservoir sites up in the north and our Manning Creek and Langdon sites to the south. The goals of our particular study, again, were to evaluate treatment efficacy with regards to this post-fire aspen regeneration, and then to look at some of the factors that we thought could potentially be influencing aspen regeneration, specifically soil heating, pre-burn, conifer encroachment, and overstory mortality. And as I mentioned, we have 3 sites, all burned at different times. 2 in the fall, 1 in the late spring, early summer, all 3 of which have little to no precipitation leading up to the application of fire. And our study sites were each divided into a number of blocks, each of which consisted of anywhere from 5 to 25 plots. And these blocks were stratified across a gradient of conifer. This figure gives you an idea of what these blocks look like before treatment. We have pre-burn basal area averaged across blocks, and then teased out by category. Blue, their aspen category, which means aspen. Our orange conifer category represents Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. And then we also took stock of all the standing that existed there prior to treatment. And you can see that there's a good bit of variability, particularly with regards to the ratio of aspen to conifer, and then the amount of snags that were located in each block. It should be noted that block number 5, which is indicated by that little red square that down there, had gone unburned in the Annabella treatment. So we'll be using that as a control block for this study. This will give you an idea of the post-fire environment, average percent mortality across blocks separated by aspen and conifer. You can see that there's quite a bit of variability at our Annabella site, with blocks ranging from completely unburned to very high severity. But you don't see that variability at Langdon and Manning. Remember that the goals of these burns were total stand replacement, so it was definitely achieved at our Langdon and Manning sites, but good bit of variability at Annabella. And you can see up in the top right, that's a little snapshot with Jesse there in the middle of one of our very high severity sites. So at first, I'd like to highlight the aspen response. Remember that jumpstarting regeneration is a big part of these treatments. And if you look at suckers per hectare over our 10 blocks, we're seeing regeneration across the board. Obviously, some more in some blocks than others, but for the purposes of restoring aspen dominance to the area, we eliminated a lot of conifer and jump-started that regeneration process. And you can see on the bottom left too that over time, these are growing and they're not being beaten back too much by the elk and the cattle that roam through some of these sites. So to get at this aspen response, we chose a couple of factors we thought might have influence over how many aspen and how fast they're growing in our plots. And first, we looked at soil heating. This part of our study was constrained to our Annabella site only. You can see up in the top right that Annabella has a good bit more plots than either of our other sites. And that was to kind of get higher spatial resolution with regards to this soil heating data. So you can see at the bottom left that we have quite a bit of variability. This is just one of our blocks. These are soil heating curves, temperature over time. Obviously, there are some tall, sharp peaks on the left on November 5th, right around there, which is the date of our burn. But we also have some flat lines, some undulation and shorter, wider peaks coming later in the month. And we're still delving pretty deeply into this data, so we'll find out more about that in the days to come. So to get at soil heating's effect on aspen suckering, we looked at sucker density over time above 60 degrees C, which is the lethal temperature for plant tissue, and then over max temperature. And you can see we're not really getting much of a tight relationship, at least tight linear relationship. It might be worth noting that with max temperature down on the bottom right, we are seeing some reduction in the number of aspen per hectare based on some of those extreme temperatures to the right. So that's something we'll be looking further into as we continue our analysis. Next, we looked at conifer encroachment, and if you'll remember, our sampling design really lent itself to taking a look at this aspen response over the gradient of conifer encroachment. We had sites that had virtually no conifer at all, and some that were almost a one-to-one. But when we plot sucker density over conifer as percentage of overstory tree fire, again, we're not seeing much of a relationship. It made sense to us that as free-burn conifer encroachment increased, we would see less aspen suckering. Not immediately obvious based on the few analyses we've done so far. We did find something that might be kind of cool. As you increase the ratio of conifer basal area to aspen basal area, we are seeing a bit of a reduction in sucker height. So potentially that as conifer encroachment increases, it has some effect on aspen sucker vigor, and this pattern seems to become more pronounced with time. So the red dots on the bottom are anabelisite, which is most recently burned, and up top we have Manning, which was a site that was burned first. So as time passes since burn, we're seeing a strengthening pattern of reduced vigor as we see more conifer relative to aspen in these plots. And lastly, we wanted to look at overstory mortality. It makes sense to us that as overstory mortality increases, we should get an increase in sucker density, especially if aspen is a component in the canopy. So we looked at a couple different measures of overstory mortality, but total basal area killed seemed to give us the best explanation, even though, again, it's still not a very tight relationship. We have a lot more metrics to look into, so stay tuned for some more of those. So to wrap it all up, I just want to reiterate that these treatments were successful in reinitiating aspen regeneration across our blocks, even though we didn't really find any hard relationships, at least with the variables we looked at so far regarding soil heating metrics and free-burn conifer encroachment. And while we did find a little bit of relationship with overstory mortality, we still have a lot of exploring to do. And I should have mentioned earlier that we did collect some fuels data that were leaving. We collected LiDAR scans, terrestrial LiDAR scans of all of these plots, or at least at Annabella, and we're planning to combine those with overstory mortality data to work that into some sort of fire severity index and see if that can tell us more of the story. And we're going to be bringing a lot of these variables together using multivariate approaches, maybe using some random forests to dig a little deeper into this aspen sucker response. And we'll be including some pre-fire climate and weather and fuel data that we don't have just yet. So again, really preliminary, a lot of exciting stuff to look at in the future. And with that, I want to again thank all my co-authors and my advisor Jesse, as well as Mike Battaglia and Sharon Hood from Rocky Mountain Research Station, who helped get this project going. public agencies and institutions that supported my work. Yeah, and with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Great, thanks, Mike. We have 5 minutes for questions, so please feel free to chime in. We actually do have one in the Q&A. How large were your sucker density plots?
We looked at suckering on a 4-meter diameter fixed circular plot.
Easy question there. Any other questions?
I'd like to follow up on that. You showed the relationship between sucker density and pre-fire and the amount of basal area that was killed, and it was a pretty poor relationship, which surprised me. Is it possible? I mean, if you're only doing a 4-meter diameter plot, that's much smaller than the radius at which suckers arise from an individual bull. And I'm wondering if that's leading to a lot of your scatter.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. We chose the 4-meter diameter because we hoped it would give us enough resolution to get at the actual suckering density while also saving time. I was out in Utah for like 5 weeks counting thousands of trees and suckers. So you can imagine there was a bit of a time constraint there. But yeah, I know like these root systems can extend for some say up to 20 meters, not counting all the connections. So it'd be interesting to get like a lot more, a lot wider of a diameter in that suckering plot.
Yeah, that's a good point, David. I wonder if a tree-centered kind of focus plot would have resolved that at all. But like you said, they're so long, it'd be challenging.
Yeah, I did something similar to that about 30 years ago up in Canada. And we had much larger plots and we had scatter, but there was a significant relationship.
Okay, that's good to know.
And then I had a question. I think you were trying to get this with the conifer encroachment, but yeah, I wondered what the vigor of the trees, how that contributed. I know there's some previous studies, I don't know exactly, I don't remember which ones, that showed that larger trees tend to sucker less potentially. There might be some size of the tree, that is important, not just basal area per se.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. We're still going to have to dig a lot deeper into some of this. Very preliminary.
The point I was also trying to make is like, if it's a poorly growing aspen, maybe it's also going to be less prolific. But these seem to be pretty prolific.
No, that's a good point. Some of our sites, it was interesting because we noticed, and particularly in our Manning site, there were areas of virtually no regeneration where aspen were present. Not a lot of aspen, but there were some, so we expected to see some suckering there. But one of the issues is a lot of this was inventoried post-fire, so there was no real way for me to evaluate aspen health ahead of time.
Yeah, I was thinking you could use tree ring growth as a proxy for vigor.
I had one question. Did you look for or observe any sexual aspen regen in the form of aspen seedlings?
I looked so hard. You would have thought that like my project was just to find an aspen seedling in all of the counting that I did, but we didn't find a single one. I used, I don't know if you're familiar with, I think it's a long and mock paper where they kind of outline some tips and tricks for distinguishing between suckers and seedlings. And again, didn't find a single thing. We also don't know what the sex was or the clones that we were in, or really the spatial distribution of these clones at all. So if possible, it'd be really cool to at some point figure out, what kind of clones we were working in and how big they were.
All right, thank you, Mike, and thanks for the questions. I think we're going to start to transition to Mike Stambaugh and move to the east a bit more. But still talking about hardwoods. Mike, I saw you in here earlier. There he is. Welcome, Mike.
Hello, how's it going?
Good. Can you share your screen?
Yep, I can.
Awesome. And take it away when you're ready.
Okay, thanks for inviting me to present at this session. Today I'm going to talk about some vegetation change data that we have located in the cross timbers of Oklahoma. My co-authors are Linda Hammer. She's a previous graduate student of mine here at the University of Missouri, as well as Ralph Godfrey, who is a fire management officer at the study site when we conducted this work. So the study site is located in southwestern Oklahoma. Oklahoma is in the south central United States in the Great Plains. In the southwestern corner of Oklahoma lies a relatively large igneous mountain range, which is called the Wichita Mountains. Within the Wichita Mountains exists about a 60,000 acre wildlife refuge, one of the first wildlife refuges established within the United States. And the region is very biologically unique. The cross timbers is a fairly simple vegetation type of two oaks, post oak and blackjack oak. It spans from Kansas into North Kansas and was largely undervalued and uncut during the transition of this country into settlement. Thus, the area contains what some people say is the largest area of old growth within the United States. It's really a biological crossroads of many flora, fauna from the southwestern United States or desert ecosystems to the central United States with grassland ecosystems, even to the eastern United States with many of our eastern deciduous forest species reaching their southwestern limit here in the mountain range, such as sugar maple and walnut. It is a mosaic of grasslands and woodland kind of vegetation types, and that's largely owed to the rugged terrain. The area we worked in was within a special use area that has active grazing and browsing by elk and buffalo. But largely this landscape behaves like a grassland as it's surrounded by hundreds of thousands of hectares of flat grassland type of vegetation. So very unique. We have been working here previously looking at the fire regime, characterizing the fire regime. Back to the 1700s, we see this area experience fire anywhere from 5 to 12 years prior to 1850. Went through a pretty abrupt transition of increased fire activity in the 1850s and saw what most of the country saw in the early 1900s, which was a slowdown of fire. In some cases, exclusion of fire. Here, it was a much more patchier fire activity through the 1900s. Fire regime would be historically considered a low to mixed severity fire regime, likely small extent of fires owed to the complex topography. And we really had no evidence of historical standard placing fires. We came to this area to really characterize the expansion of eastern red cedar across grasslands, mountaintop terrain. And this map shows the outline of our study area in white. This is about a 30,000 acre part of the refuge, and those little circles represent our vegetation plots that we were characterizing eastern red cedar expansion. So a little over 340 vegetation plots were established up into 2011. And just so happened that a couple months after the establishment of our plots, there was a high severity fire that I'll talk about in a minute. This plot on the bottom shows the expansion of eastern red cedar, which is a juniper species across the refuge over the last 500 years. You can see just kind of an exponential increase in eastern red cedar from about the 1850s, with some sorts of perhaps episodic increases along that progression. Eastern red cedar is a concern across the Great Plains. It's changing fire behavior as well as hydrologic processes. So it's really encroaching upon this refuge. Also in 2010, there was a kind of a severe ice storm in the winter, which caused lots of canopy breakage, lots of incorporation of woody fuels to the ground, as well as in aerial positions, including even heavy fuels. So we have lots of hanging 1,000-hour fuels here in 2010. And so in 2011, we wrapped up our vegetation plot work, and 2 months later, during a very extreme drought condition, so we're looking at -4 or less in terms of PDSI, there was an accidental ignition within the refuge area that burned about 40,000 acres, including many of our plots. This is kind of a really unique fire to look at, as these types of high severity fire events are really not that common across the eastern deciduous forest. This would be transitional forest, but it's a really unique opportunity that, one, we had all these plots installed before the fire happened, and we're able to revisit those plots across a variety of changes. So here at the top, you can see the pictures at the top are pre-burn and post-burn, left and right, for a couple different plots here, showing the changes in the woodland kind of structure and vegetation composition following this stand replacing fire. The fire happened in September, so there were still leaves on the trees, and that's why there could actually be crowning through this deciduous forest type. Here you're looking at burn severity classifications for this Ferguson fire. On the left is the initial assessment map, with the reds being the high severity patches and the dark greens being the unburned patches. And then there's the extended assessment map on the right from July 2012. We went through a whole CBI, or composite burn index, and burn severity classification exercise for this fire, and found the best results for burn severity classification was achieved with the initial assessment using the DNBR threshold values. They're shown at the bottom of this slide. So we had, again, 340 plots within this fire. About 300 of them lied within the fire perimeter, and then we were able to stratify those by burn severity. Here's just a few images showing the severity to the substrate. So here you can see igneous rocks with the rings from where the soil as well as organic material had been removed post-fire. Here's the understory of an oak woodland that's more or less completely removed, and starting back from primary succession. And then backing up from that image, here you can see a broader landscape, as well as that same oak woodland showing that stand replacing condition, as well as a real explosion of forbs in this image, colonizing forbs immediately post-fire. So the objectives of the study were to characterize burn severity using CBI, as well as the remeasurement of our vegetation plots, and then assess the performance of this classification, looking at the relationship between actual CBI scores and our vegetation plot changes. We had 120 plots that we stratified in 4 burn severity classes: high, moderate, low, burned. We revisited those plots again in 2012 following the fire, And we installed the CBI plots right within our existing vegetation plots. The vegetation plots had information on topography, canopy cover within the plot, numbers of seedlings, so those were trees less than a ½ meter tall, saplings, trees ½ meter tall to 5 centimeters DBH, and then actual trees, which we considered 5 centimeters DBH or greater. And I know that probably sounds like a very small tree, but these are relatively poor sites, and trees do not grow large in diameter or in very tall heights within this cross timbers ecoregion. We also have measures of tree density, including trees per acre, basal area, and then we have measures of tree aerial cover, and then we have several different measurements of ground cover by functional groups. And then we paired those data with our CBI data, including the scores, the CBI scores at each of the strata. So the scores at the substrate, grass forb, low shrub, tree level, tall shrubs, intermediate trees, and trees. Today, I'm going to be mostly talking about the summary statistics of the vegetation plot change as it relates to the CBI scores. And I'll show you that through mostly summary statistics, as well as through some of the correlation analysis between CBI scores and vegetation change. So what you're seeing here on the right is a table with going across the top are the different CBI strata. So we have substrate strata, grass strata, shrub strata, so on and so forth. And then down the left column are plot changes. So the top box represents the % change in ground cover. And here you have changes to the substrate, or I can't hardly see the soil cover, litter, grass, forb, shrub. And then at the bottom box, those are changes to stem density. So seedlings, saplings, trees, and basal area. And what I've done here is shown you the Pearson correlation. So that's the R value, the P is the P value, and the N is the number of samples there. And then shaded are the CBI strata and what we would expect them to relate to in terms of what they would correlate to in terms of the changes that we would see at the plot. And generally we see we see significant correlations in the places that we would expect to see them in terms of actual change within the plot relating to what we would score the severity to be within the different strata. Some of the strata that don't perform well in terms of what actually happened on the plot would be, for example, what we see within the grass strata or shrub strata. Here with this fire, we see actually a negative relationship with burn severity for grass and a positive relationship with forbs. And that's, we saw a lot of grass mortality from this fire, but in a lot of increasing in annuals. And those are the forbs that you're seeing there. And then on the bottom right, you're seeing the short tree and tall tree strata relating mostly to the stem densities of saplings and trees, as well as basal area. And one of the things I wanted to point out from this whole table really is that this stem density of trees provides one of the best and highest correlations over all classes or all vegetation plot changes that we witness. So basically, changes in tree stem density is one of the best indicators for burn severity at all these different strata layers. This is just a table summarizing the changes in tree characteristics. So again, these are the trees are the 5 centimeters and DBH and larger. So what you're seeing here are the average changes outside of the parentheses, and then the minimum and maximum changes across low, moderate, and high burn severity. So for all trees, we saw anywhere from a decrease in maybe 2 meters square per hectare for low burn severities up to 7 or 8 meters square per hectare in the high burn severity. And there's really no major patterns that we see by species. Here we're seeing trees per hectare. All species more or less decline across all burn severities, which is, of course, what we'd expect. And for this landscape, we see some of the largest decreases for Quercus marylandica or blackjack oak within the tree strata. If we look at the changes in stems per hectare here at the top left, we're seeing basically each of the plots and the change in trees per hectare as you go from unburned conditions, which is shown in green, to the low severity, which is below this first dash line. Moderate severity would be in this middle area, and then high severity would be in this upper third of the graph. And so we see kind of a neat patterning here of increasing losses in trees per hectare as we increase in burn severity for the trees. As you go into saplings, that gets a little more messy. We see actually some increases in sapling size trees in the moderate burn severity. I can talk about that more later. And then for seedlings, we see mostly increases in seedling densities for increasing or above moderate burn severities. And a lot of that's due to trees resprouting. If we unpack this tree category, focus here on post oak and blackjack oak, is we primarily see no response until we get into the moderate or higher burn severities in terms of decreases in this case, basal area for those species. To look at these changes in trees per hectare by species, here we see 3 plots, one for the trees, one for the saplings, and one for the seedlings. We focus on trees, we're seeing again what we saw in the table. We see the largest decreases in stem densities for black oak across this, or blackjack oak for across this landscape. Really no increases, which is what we expect. For saplings, we're seeing also the largest decreases for blackjack oak, but we see some increases for blackjack oak as well as what would be in the class of other species. So that's a whole mix of more shrubby or small tree species such as hackberry, soapberry, those types of species. And then for the seedlings, we see large increases actually for particularly blackjack oak in some of these plots, including some of the high severity and moderate severity plots. For eastern red cedar, I haven't mentioned that much, but essentially if there's any type of fire, eastern red cedar is declining. Okay, I'm going to skip through this for just for time's sake. So in summary, the changes to vegetation are highly variable across all burn severities. Generally, maximum decreases in vegetation cover and tree density are observed with increasing burn severity. Tree density is one of the best variables for burn severity for all strata. So if you weren't going to measure CBI, then just looking at actual changes in tree density may be a good measure of burn severity for this vegetation type. Seedlings showed varied response to increasing severity, but were mostly increased, largely due to the resprouting of many of these oak species. This is not the case for eastern red cedar, where eastern red cedar, especially seedlings, are an excellent indicator of the transition from burned to unburned conditions. And then lastly, at the bottom, we see a large increase in dominance in blackjack oak, especially for seedlings and saplings. And in 2011, there were actually quite a number of high severity fires across southern Oklahoma and Texas. And this trend of increasing blackjack oak dominance has been seen in other areas that have monitoring going on as well. Which just end here with a little comment on blackjack. Blackjack is largely failing to regenerate across many sites in the eastern United States. It often occurs on xeric and nutrient limited sites, including those with other species that are similar in ecology, such as blue jack oak and sand post oak, for example. It's historically fairly prevalent in areas that are known to have high severity fires, such as in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, or in areas with very frequent fires, such as an association with longleaf. And it's going to be, or at least for some amount of time, the dominant survivor in many of these high severity burn events, which I think is very interesting, and especially if it is an indicator of historical high severity fires in this part of the United States. So with that, I'd like to thank the Fish and Wildlife Service for providing a lot of support for this project. We received a lot of guidance and data help from both Nate Benson and Stephen Howard. And then we have several folks to thank for participating on our cruise.
All right. Thanks, Mike. We're ran out of time, so no time for questions, but maybe if there's an opening later in the session, we can take some. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Appreciate it. And then we're going to transition. I'll introduce Matt Hertau as he queues up his slides.
Actually, we're going to take a little break.
Oh, we are. Okay.
Yeah. So real quick, thanks to all of our speakers for sharing their expertise today. This session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Up next, we have a 20-minute break before our next round of breakout sessions begin. We'd love to see you here, but you can choose from our second virtual field trip, 5 special sessions, and 1 general session. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the agenda tab on the left side of your screen, click sessions, and click the main session title to join. To join the session offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, be sure to select the session titled Ecosystem Services. Thanks again to our speakers, and Jeff, looking forward to seeing you over in the next session in about 20 minutes.
Thanks,
Take care, everybody.
Yeah, appreciate you letting me know that. And if anybody wants to stick around and ask if Mike's still here, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we'll see you in 20.